ISO and documentation. Hello everyone, this is Sunita Verma, Principal Consultant at Sync Resource, an outfit in Atlanta. ISO requirements have always been associated with a lot of documentation, and everybody that I speak with is concerned about the length and the extent of these documents. So let's start with a little bit of education here as to what amount of documentation is required. To start with, people follow the tier diagram, which starts something like this: tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Tier 1 is policy and manual. Tier 2 is procedures, SOPs or work instructions. Tier 3 is forms. These are templates and records. Sometimes this tier 2, is broken down further into procedures, and the tier 3 is SOPs and work instructions, and tier 4 is the forms or the templates and records. Now, the standard doesn't say that every organization has to have the same amount of documentation, but it does say that there are some mandatory documents that are required and mandatory records that are required. How you develop these is left to the organization to decide on the criticality of the processes. So documentation has to be to that extent which explains the processes and make sure there is monitoring and measurement of the process and some improvements that come out. It is not necessary that you have 50 procedures or a manual which is like 150 pages. It depends on the size of your organization and the processes. So a small size of or a micro size of organization doesn't need to have all these tiers. It can be very simply documented. One manual which has the procedures defined within it, which have the forms identified, is sufficient. But if it's a larger organization, a medium size of organization, then it would be necessary to have these tiers so that different departments, it becomes easier to manage these documents and make sure that different departments are reviewing them periodically. So documentation is critical, but the extent of documentation is defined by the organization. Now, a lot of standards are moving away from having a manual. And if that is a good thing or not, it just depends on what you want to communicate. So manuals are used as, typically manuals are used to communicate your processes to stakeholders. These stakeholders can be internal, these stakeholders can be external. Internal stakeholders meaning employees, internal stakeholders meaning all the subcontractors who are working with you. External meaning these are your vendors, suppliers, these can be some outsourced processes, and your customers or prospects for that matter. So this is what the documentation has to be in a snapshot. Thank you.